Thank you so much. I appreciate that very much. And you'll forgive me for reading my presentation, because if I tried to ad-lib it, you would be here until about 8 o'clock tonight. As Sarah can tell you, I get very excited about this project. On February 22nd, 1856, a 28-year-old school teacher from Rockingham County, North Carolina, was brought to the North Carolina Hospital for the Insane in Raleigh, suffering from exposure to the sun. He was admitted and thus became the first person to be institutionalized by the state for the treatment of mental illness. That day was much anticipated and the result of years of advocacy and political lobbying, including the tireless efforts of Dorothea Dix, a campaigner for humane treatment of the mentally ill. And it had been a political issue as well. Governor John Motley Moorhead chafed at the state's dubious distinction of being the only one of the 13 original states without an insane asylum. So he commissioned prominent New York architect Alexander Jackson Davis to build the best structure in the country for providing what was called moral treatment for insanity. Quite literally an asylum from the social and physical circumstance that contributed to the sufferer's illness, a place apart where they could be humanely cared for. Dorothea Dix played a role in the establishment of more than 30 such asylums. And as was the case with the hospital in Raleigh, these were frequently the largest and most expensive institutional structures in the state at the time. The superintendents of these institutions became the first generation of psychiatrists. The American Journal of Insanity, which was edited by the superintendents of these hospitals and asylums, became the American Journal of Psychiatry. Officially renamed Dorothea Dix Hospital in 1959, the hospital was known, as we've heard, as Dix Hill for years. Thousands upon thousands of UNC healthcare professionals rotated through Dix, and in the early 2000s, the state decided to close the hospital, and the last patients were transferred out in 2012. The City of Raleigh bought the 306-acre site and its 85 buildings from the state for $52 million in 2015, and plans are now underway to transform this park into a destination park, Raleigh's signature public space, its Central Park. The Community Histories Workshop has been funded by the Conservancy Board to recover the history of the site. We are a small group of students, faculty, staff, historians, archivists, technologists, digital humanists, organized in 2016. And we work with local communities to recover, preserve, and share the memories, stories, and materials that reflect the multi-layered history of place. Among the records preserved by the State Archives in North Carolina are ledgers listing every patient admitted to the hospital, beginning with that patient number 1. An archivist in the reading room shared the ledgers with me for the first time in the summer of 2017. The ledgers are, in effect, 19th century spreadsheets. Each row across the verso and recto of the ledger is a patient, and each column down the page is attributes about that patient. Name, gender, age, county of residence, occupation, marital status, the supposed cause of the admission, the form, the diagnosis of the ailment, and it follows the patient through the duration of his or her stay until the patient is released, transferred, or dies. I asked the archivist if anyone outside the hospital had used the ledgers for systematic research, and the consensus was that this was unlikely. Until recently, the records would have been indefinitely sequestered. But a change in the state's open records law exposed state records created more than 100 years old, including these patient identifiable records in the admissions ledger. This meant that the records created prior to 1918 could be publicly accessed, photographed in the reading room, and that there were no statutory restrictions on the circulation or publication of these images or the information contained in them. It was apparent that the admission ledger was an extraordinary resource, but in its current state, its utility was limited. With no index, the chronologically arranged ledgers were very difficult to research. The reading room staff agreed that these were good candidates for scanning, but they would have to stand in a long queue of many other state archive records identified as priorities. That could take a year or more just to reach to the top of that stack. As handwritten documents, the ledger pages could not be mechanically transcribed through OCR. Sarah and I recruited 5 undergraduate students, all of whom had taken a course with me, and enlisted other members of the team. And we photographed some 600 ledger pages in the State Archives reading room. and in January of last year began the transcription and digitization process, again accomplished for the most part by 5 undergraduate research students. By the end of August, they had finished the first draft of the spreadsheet. This semester has been devoted to data cleaning and to creating limited vocabulary categories for such fields as supposed cause and form. We've successfully ingested the spreadsheet into Prospect, which is a UNC-developed humanities data visualization plugin for WordPress. And we've created, I keep altering these adjectives, but no one has argued with me. We have created what I think is the first comprehensive searchable patient database for a 19th century American insane asylum. The database will form the centerpiece of an offering of a research seminar I'm doing next semester, American Studies 840. There are flyers on the table in the back about this class. It will show as full, but I really am eager to get participants from the health affairs side of things. I know that can be difficult with the curricula that they are in or their training, but if you know any graduate professional students that you think would be interested in this, by all means have them contact me. Just eyeballing these records in spreadsheet forms is, I think, to use an appropriate 19th century term, mesmerizing. Particularly arresting are the supposed causes. The belief at the time was that many types of insanity were the result of what we might call trigger events today, occurring to someone with an underlying psychic fragility or vulnerability. Thus, the death of a loved one, financial loss, religious excitement, domestic trouble. In the case of 4 patients in 1886, an earthquake could be a supposed cause for someone for mental illness, for someone whose psychic resources were not sufficient to deal with it. The finding aid for the state's Dorothea Dix record group led us to another set of extraordinary records, what we refer to as the general case ledgers. Kept from 1887 to 1934, these bound volumes contain large format printed forms, 11 by 17, filled out for each patient at the time of admission. The information collected is far more extensive than that recorded in the admissions ledger. Each page contains 100 fields, which were filled out at the time the patient was admitted. They cover patient identity and relationships, family history, personal history, patient appearance, medical history and condition, behavior, including manifestations of the particular mental illness for which the patient is being admitted. Especially for the first years the general case books were kept, there are notes on the reverse side of the form regarding the patient's condition following admission. We're now finishing up photographing of all the general case books between 1887 and 1918 and plan to link them to the corresponding admission ledger records to create a subset of 5,500 patients admitted over the 31-year span between 1887 and 1918, some 660,000 data points. For more than a decade, I've taught courses on family history and the history of the family, and it became quickly apparent to me that this basic patient information from the admission ledgers could serve as a starting point for researching the lives before and after their stay at Dix, using online genealogical source material. Furthermore, I suspected that some of these individuals would appear in the nearly 4 million pages of pre-1923 North Carolina newspapers that had been digitized from the North Carolina collection. It took me less than an hour to track down a 24-year-old man admitted to the asylum in 1897, suffering from religious and financial trouble. Shortly before his admission, several stories about him appeared in Raleigh newspapers. He had beaten a woman to death with his umbrella. In another hour, I was able to construct a family tree for him and determined that one of his 2 sisters had committed suicide, while the other appeared in the 1940 federal census as a patient at the asylum in Milledgeville, Georgia, which had 17,000 patients. His brother served several terms as a city alderman and once ran for the General Assembly on an anti-evolution platform. My attempt to recover more about the identity and life of the first male patient at the hospital wasn't particularly successful, so I moved to the first female patient, Annie M. Kirkland, 37-year-old widow from Orange County whose supposed cause for admission was domestic trouble and was diagnosed with mania. The first search term returned for her in Ancestry.com led me to the grave of a woman named Anna Cameron Kirkland, buried beside her husband Alexander Kirkland at the Kirkland family home in Hillsborough, Airmount, one of the best preserved 18th century structures in the county. Updating my research terms with this information caused Ancestry.com to light up like a proverbial pinball machine. Anna was a member of the Cameron family, one of the most affluent and socially connected families of the 19th century in North Carolina. Her father was not particularly prominent, but her uncle, Duncan Cameron, was one of the richest men in the state, owning Staggville, the largest plantation in North Carolina, and the owner of 900 slaves. The Southern Historical Collection contains the Cameron family papers, some 33,000 items, and we have spent the last year identifying and transcribing more than 200 letters from, to, or about Anna Cameron Kirkland, documenting her nearly 50-year struggle with what I suspect we would call today some form of depression. She spent 33 years of her life as a patient at Dix Hospital. Let me give you just, we're still at the point of trying to corral all of the questions that arise from this data into something that we could follow up on. I bet if I gave you 5 minutes, you could write down 5 questions that you would ask about this data. And in fact, I would encourage you to do so and send it to us. Thank you. And if you see ways that we might incorporate this into interdisciplinary research projects or into clinical training, I am really eager to hear from you. But let me give you just one set of questions that I'm working on that have emerged in the last 2 weeks that I think can be made to speak to the history of the treatment of the insane and the emergence of psychiatry in the latter part of the 19th century. In a 1996 essay in the Journal of Social History, medical historian Howard Kushner argues that in the 19th century, leaders of the asylum movement on both sides of the Atlantic were trying to develop a theory of suicide as a category of insanity to address what social commentators saw as an epidemic of not insanity, suicide, epidemic of suicide in big cities. Emil Durkheim, one of the founders of modern sociology, wrote Suicide, a study in sociology in 1897. He and his contemporaries saw instances of suicide directly connected with the social and psychic disruptions caused by modern urban life. It is, they said, the price we pay for civilization. So a number of axioms unfold from this general theory. The most likely to commit suicide are urban middle-class men. Adopting the sentimental view of 19th century gender relations, positioning women as the angels of the hearth, these alienists, the first psychiatrists, invoked a reciprocal theory of women's immunity from the fatal attraction of suicide based on religious principles, self-renunciation, and forbearance. Playing out the logic of this corollary means that women who did attempt suicide were likely to have abandoned or resisted their traditional gender roles as wives or mothers in an attempt to operate in a male-dominated sphere. In 1897, Richard Rees wrote that women's intrusions into vocations carried serious psychic consequences. Durkheim and his fellows were eager to authorize their theories by grounding them in empirical evidence provided by the emerging science of social statistics. Durkheim set the terms by which suicide would be counted, and hence from which suicide statistics would be derived. And for Durkheim, suicide was an outcome. It was the result, the fatal result, of a self-inflicted injury to a person. The Dix Ledgers and General Casebook provide us with an extraordinary opportunity to revisit this scholarship using the records of 7,200 admissions, asylum admissions over a 61-year period. Now, for the humanities, that's big data. Furthermore, we can take both a 30,000-foot view of the aggregated data, but we can also drill down to the level of the individual human being. And here are quick examples of both of these historiographic perspectives. The admissions ledgers give us an opportunity to reframe suicide as what we would now call suicidality. That is, suicidal behavior and ideation that might or might not result in self-inflicted death. And when you do that, you discover that it was women who suffered from suicidality more than men in the 19th century, which is still the case today. It gives us an opportunity to create a subset of 789 women who were described as suicidal in the patient records between 1856 and 1918. The first person for whom there is a general casebook entry was a woman. In 1887, Naomi, as I'll call her, was brought from Henderson County to Vance County by her son. She was a 43-year-old widow. Her husband had been a merchant. She arrived at the hospital neat, tidy, and well-dressed, but she had some difficulty walking. the reason for which was revealed when her clothes were removed in her physical examination. She was found to have an irregular abdominal wound 4 inches long on her left side of her torso. Her doctor and son explained that the wound was self-inflicted. It was, in fact, her second suicidal attempt. The first had been from an overdose of laudanum. She suffered no defects or perversions of feeling or intellect, except for great depression and an overpowering desire to die. Continuing from the bottom of the intake form, on the second pages are notes following her condition or treatment. The first notes are dated a month into her stay. She could not provide any explanation by train of reasoning for her attempts at suicide. She just felt, she said, that life was unendurable and thought how sweet it would be to go to sleep and never again wake up in this world. When she realized that stabbing herself in the abdomen had not created the desired effect, she thrust her hand in the wound and attempted to pull out her intestines. We don't know who kept these notes. Perhaps it was the asylum superintendent himself, Eugene Grissom, who was at the time of Naomi's admission president of the Association of Superintendents of American Insane Asylums, now the American Psychiatric Association. Whether Grissom or his lieutenant wrote the notes declare, in this case there seems to be an essential connection between insanity, wait for it, and the second climactic period. These manifestations have been since her admission here those of simple melancholia, depression, sadness. She has shown no propensity to suicide. Within 3 days, she was more talkative, less despondent, more cheerful. In other words, the supposed cause of these 2 suicidal attempts was menopause. Her menstrual cycle was closely observed. She had 2 periods that were apparently normal, and the following year she was discharged after 6 months and declared sane. On November 20th, 2018, the New York Times published a 40th anniversary edition of their weekly Science Times section, and they asked reporters who had contributed to the section over the past 15 years to pose questions, the most pressing questions in science. Question number 1 was, does the universe still need Einstein? Question number 2 was, when will we solve mental illness? Science and Medicine reporter Benedict Carey argued that biological psychiatry had not produced a transformative breakthrough in our understanding or solution of mental illness over the past decades, but it did suggest guideposts for the next generation of research. The first, he said, was that the current diagnostic system does not map well onto any shared biology. Depression is not one ailment, but many. The second was the limited effect of biology upon mental illness. Biological difference and heredity play a role, he said, but the remainder of the risk is supplied by experience. The messy combination of trauma, substance use, loss, and identity crisis that make up any individual's intimate personal history. Biology has nothing to say about these factors, he said, but people do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you, Bobby. I definitely agree with the New York Times article, but I also believe that though heredity may play a small role in the diagnosis or cure of mental illness, it's inevitably present in the genealogy of mental illness. In a groundbreaking 2013 study by the cross-disorder group of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD were found to be linked to the same common inherited genetic variations. Mental disorders may not follow typical patterns of inheritance, but something is most certainly there. My argument is ethical, though, not medical. Let's go back to one of Dr. Allen's first discoveries for a moment. A young man with a prominent family name, frankly, a still prominent family name, admitted to Dorothea Dix Hospital just days after beating a woman to death with an umbrella in 1897. Dr. Allen's reconstruction of his family tree and the subsequent realization that one of his sisters was a patient at a Georgia asylum and the other had committed suicide, it gave me pause. As a public historian and an archivist, I feel that it's my duty to bring forgotten and obscured histories to light. But considering the ethical implications of such access, especially digital access, is also part of my work. Clearly, this database that we're building can be used for groundbreaking research initiatives. It can be used to answer myriad questions from families across the state with an inkling of an idea that a long-distant relative spent time at the hospital. But what if it's used for something more sinister? The use of pre-existing conditions by American insurance companies isn't that far behind us. I'm going to quote Alice R. Wexler, who authored an exceptional article about chorea and Huntington's disease here, because she's worded her observations so elegantly. The historical study of families associated with a genetic disease poses complex dilemmas relating to privacy and confidentiality, particularly in a society in which health, life, and disability insurers routinely deny coverage to those with illness in their families. And what are the families themselves? Though there has certainly been a movement in recent years to reclaim the identities of the mentally ill, it remains a social stigma for many. Further, the diagnoses that we see in these admissions logs, they don't have the careful language of modern psychiatric diagnosis. Patients are described as imbeciles, inebriates, opium fiends, and chronic masturbators. That's not the language that many people want to associate with their great-great-grandparent or a distant aunt. Lastly, though, our case studies have had a humanizing and empathetic effect. In some cases, we've been even able to trace a patient's genealogy and the genealogy of their mental illness all the way up until the present day. How lengthy, though, does the reach of our ethical consideration need to be? Most social historians of the past 40 years agree that confidentiality and privacy are due to the patients that they study, but more recent scholarship in the Asylum studies has put an emphasis on the ethical duty due to those patients' descendants. On the other hand, many studying the histories of Native American and African American patients in the 19th century asylum assert that anonymization pushes their subjects even further into the shadows and robs them of their agency. So who gets to access this valuable resource that we're building? How do we decide? Do we act as gatekeepers? And if so, what are the implications of that behavior in our current landscape? Ethical considerations surround this project, extending even to the ways that we clean our data and create limited vocabularies to enable data visualizations. The CHW's talked with other archivists, medical humanities faculty, even members of the Parr Center for Ethics, and everyone has a different take on this situation. We all agree that the subject is important and necessary, but there are, as of now, no archival best practices in place for sensitive information in the digital humanities. When you combine that with the fact that users often engage digital humanities tools with an assumption of authority and a frequent application of confirmation bias, these questions loom even larger. And then here we are with this fascinating project that has done nothing but illuminate how thoroughly woven Dorothea Dix Hospital and its patients are into the fabric of North Carolina. I've made these questions the subject of my master's thesis for the School of Information and Library Science next semester, and I'm by no means an expert yet. But in my remaining time, I'm just going to briefly discuss some of our proposed best practices for the Dorothea Dix database and just give you an idea of their justifications. I know I'm running over time, so I am gonna make this very, very brief, but bear with me because I think it's pretty important. We're in a unique position in that we are researchers creating a database for researchers. In our transcription process, we have been careful to replicate misspellings, errors, and unique notations as found in the original admissions ledgers. As anyone involved with data will let you know, though, preserving the eccentricities of the historical record does very little to create compelling or informative data visualizations or quantitative insight. For example, as transcribed, we have 24 separate terms under the form field for dementia praecox, a historical diagnosis similar to schizophrenia. Student transcribers have used historical documents that we've identified as definitive, such as the report on defective, dependent, and delinquent classes from the 1880 census, and the 1918 Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane, a precursor to the DSM, to narrow these terms in a way that permits visualization. They've also used the annual reports of Dorothea Dix Hospital, stored in this very library, to double-check classifications and groupings of the forms and supposed causes of mental illness specific to Dix Hill. We're in the very exciting process of uploading this cleaned and classified data now, but with an eye towards historical ethics, we're keeping the original data in the database in the event that researchers may wish to see it. Similarly, the names, counties of residents, and all other identifying information exist as transcribed in the database at this time. There are many historical precedents for anonymizing identifying patient information in asylum studies. Even with the records openly available to the public, many historians of health and medicine have chosen to use pseudonyms or initials in publications that refer to specific patients, retaining a key or natural identifier like a patient number so that the veracity of their research can be checked. Considering the large amount of data that we're making available, the CHW has largely agreed on a plan to remove patient names from the public-facing side of the database. The question of whether to leave the patient number or key, however, is still up for debate. The lingering concern we have in this instance is particular to the digital humanities. In one of our first formal conversations about the ethics of the database, SILS professor Denise Anthony pointed out that though these records are public and open and available at the North Carolina State Archives, putting them into a searchable digital form hosted online provides an unprecedented ease of access. The traditional process of visiting the archives does provide patient-determined access, but online access is unbounded by this and therefore has to be thought of differently. One of the solutions that we've put forward for this database is limiting the use of the database to those within the institution, providing password-protected access to the anonymized version, with potential access to the transcribed version available on a case-by-case basis. Similarly, we've considered sharing the use of the database with the state archives so that they can establish access to the transcribed version to their researchers on a case-by-case basis as well. By doing this, though, are we letting our desire to protect patients' families overshadow the reclamation of these hidden histories? I don't know the answer, but I do have to remind myself continually that our primary goal is to provide a tool for research and not perform the research itself. Determining the balance between access and ethical responsibility to patients has been and continues to be a complicated navigation for us. There's reason to wonder even whether all of these questions are even necessary. David Wright and Renee Saucier, in a 2012 paper about ethics and mental health history research, point out that despite high anxiety on the part of medical history communities since the beginning of the social history movement in the 1980s, there has been no predominant scandal that has altered the landscape of access or research in the discipline over the last quarter of a century. They suggest that maybe our anxiety over mental health records reflects a lingering social stigma. I'm not entirely certain that I agree, but I can assert that the new territories explored by the application of digital humanities initiatives, much like our database, are pushing these conversations in new and exciting ethical directions. Thank you.